I'm doing this so that we can see you. Share screen. Let's see.
Thank you. Go to window
Well,
or view.
all right, Mike, if you just push this down button, it'll go through your slides.
Okay.
So up goes backwards, down goes forwards.
Okay.
So just those two buttons right there.
Got it.
You're on, man.
Well, all right. Thank you much. Well, welcome to a 2-week study, Yeshua, the Jewish Jesus. Now, let me start out by saying what instigated or inspired this exploration. I want to know Jesus. I mean, I really want to know. I want to know the mind of Jesus. What was the rabbinical mind? And, you know, we know historically, we're told from the time we're knee-high, Jesus was Jewish. He was born to very devout Jewish parents. But do we really truly appreciate just how Jewish he was? And the more and deeper I dig, the more I find out he was hardcore, devout, probably the true Orthodox Jew. Now, he was at odds with his contemporaries, but it wasn't over the law itself. Nothing he ever preached conflicted with the law, God's law. Now, there was interpretations, just like there's theology. He had issues with that. We see that, and we'll explore that later on as we really dig into the scriptures. We're going to go bounce back and forth between the Gospels and then going back to Leviticus and some of the books of the prophets. Now, in trying to conceive Jesus, I mean, it's a very mystical thing. I mean, it tells us in John chapter 1, verse 1. I think it's the most beautiful existential statement that sums up exactly who Yeshua was. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word being who? Jesus. The Word was with God. The Word was God. God incarnate. So it only leaves one to imagine, okay, was he born from the time he was born a baby? Was all of this knowledge plugged into him? After all, he's God. And therefore, he was part of the inspiration when all of this stuff was written thousands of years before him. Or did he, over time, accumulate this knowledge upon finally realizing who he was and what his mission was? I believe and am under the impression that from the time he was born, through his formidable years as a toddler, in his grammar school age years, till maybe about puberty, his life was very normal for a first century Galilean kid. Now, maybe because he was baby God, he was an especially good baby, and maybe let Mary and Joseph sleep at night and wasn't hard to potty train and didn't learn the word no like most kids learn their first one. A lot of what I did is I went through, not that version because I don't read Hebrew, Talmud, Midrash, and Mishnah, which gives us a very beautiful, exact picture of what growing up as a child in first century Galilee would be like. And I get a very distinct picture of what boy Jesus's life was probably like, which would be no different from a lot of his contemporaries. Being very family oriented, we know that Jesus had some brothers. We get scant pictures of what his boyhood is like. The recorded history is primarily his ministry from age 30 to 33 through the crucifixion, resurrection, and then, of course, the ascension. What clues we are given is we're told about his birth. We're told about his parents quickly flee in exile to Egypt, which I'm pretty sure was Alexandria. It just makes sense to me. And the reason why, at that time of Jesus's life, the population of Alexandria, Egypt, was 35% Jewish. It had a Jewish quarter, which had been established by Alexander the Great way back when, which began diaspora. So it only makes sense that a Jewish family would go with other Jews because people who know their culture, people that they worship with, people that knew the law, and they wouldn't stick out like sore thumbs. And we know that once Herod passed away, an angel came to Joseph and said, okay, all clear. You can go back now. Now, one of the things I find interesting is that, well, Joseph was a carpenter. He was a builder. He was a skilled tradesman. So it would make sense, for the sake of opportunity, because of all the infrastructure building going on in Jerusalem, even after Herod died. Because remember, Herod never saw the completion of the temple. The temple itself wasn't completed till 68 AD, which would be, some 60 years after his death. And unfortunately, it was completely destroyed only 2 years after in 70 AD. But it would make sense that for a skilled tradesman, why not go to Jerusalem? He could, pick up, apply his trade, maybe make a good living. But no, he found out Herod's son, and you read this in Josephus and Antiquities of the Jews. Herod's son was a nutcase, just like his dad. I mean, he was so bad the Romans hated him and unseated him. So Joseph, in his infinite wisdom, just bypassed Jerusalem, went up to Galilee and settled in Nazareth. Now, what was it like to be a kid in Galilee in the first century? Well, education started at the age of 5. Here's Galilee, and you can see right there's Nazareth. And of course, this is the infamous Sea of Galilee where all the fishing went on. Now, people have this idea that Galilee was not exactly known for intellectual thought or high education. After all, we read in the scriptures, you remember this verse from one of the soon-to-be disciples, Nazareth, can anything good come from Nazareth? And they were amazed and marveled, saying one to another, behold, are not all these that speak Galileans? Like, these guys sound too smart. Well, as you can see on my title, Galileans were considered uneducated Jewish rednecks. That's just nationalism speaking. I mean, and how this applies to us, like here's Argo, there's Verbena, there's Jemison.
So like Tennessee fans, uneducated.
Yeah.
rednecks.
Exactly. Right. However,
Hey,
there's nothing farther from the truth. It turns out, and we learn in the Talmud, Galilee was a rabbinical hotbed. There was some great education going on there. The Talmud lists a long list, even during the time of Jesus, of very popular rabbis. That's one, Yohanan ben Zakkai. Here's another one. He was like the rock star of rabbis during Jesus's day, Zadok. And why these guys were so popular, it's not just because they were had such great knowledge. They were fantastic orators. They had an uncanny ability to be able to take the law and not get into the theological technicalities, but be able to apply it to what life meant now. How do we live now? You know, law was written way back then. Yeah, it still applies now, but how does it apply now while we're under Roman occupation? How should we live? As you can appreciate, nothing about Yeshua's life was coincidental. He was born at a particular time for a reason, born in a particular place for a reason. And I think because of this, learning this about the rabbis, that him growing up in a rabbinical factory only makes perfect sense for him to be in a place where the law was so important, where the law was lived, where the law was discussed, the law was debated. Judean children began their education at the age of 5. Now, they learned by what was called oral Torah. Now, what was oral Torah? Let's go back in time. For those of you that were in the Bible study with us this time last year called Law Under Siege, which was a study of the evolution of the Second Temple, oral Torah was born out of necessity. First and foremost, even from in Jesus's time, writing materials were scarce. You know, the whole premise of you not only had to write this stuff out, you had to make the stuff to write it on. Oral Torah came about because when the Second Temple period was just being established under the governor Zerubbabel, and the prophet Ezra is reestablishing the law because people of Jerusalem, the Jews, had been in Babylon for 70 years, and some of the law had not been observed. There were 2 challenges. Number one, there weren't a lot of written copies of it. And number 2, another language just happened to develop during that 70 years. It was a Babylonian tongue by nature. Before Babylon, everybody in Judea spoke Hebrew. After Babylon, half of them spoke this other tongue. Anybody want to take a guess what that tongue was? Aramaic, that's right. So here's Ezra. You know, he's up here in the town square. He's got the Torah, he's reading the Torah, and he's reading in Hebrew because it's written in Hebrew. And then there's a guy standing next to him and translating in Aramaic. That's just the way it was because that's all they had. And that was the birth, the very early seedlings of the Pharisaic movement, oral Torah. We don't have the materials to be able to hand everybody a copy of the Torah. We're going to have to memorize it. And this remained intact even after the destruction of Jerusalem in 135 AD. After the temple had been destroyed in 70 AD, there was one last attempt at a Jewish revolt. In 132, the Romans just said, had enough, and they completely flattened Jerusalem and forbade Jews from ever entering it again for another 100 years. So, oral Torah was the teaching method of rabbis, as they were the Pharisee sect. Now, we know that Sadducees believed in written Torah and written Torah only. And I would imagine if we had a Sadducee with us and we asked him why that is, he'd give us a pretty logical reason. Look, if it's in writing and it's right there in front of you, there's no chance to get it wrong because human memory is fallible. Oy vey. And he's right. However, the Pharisees, the rabbis were sticklers, every jot, every tittle. Children would begin memorizing the Torah from the age of 5. They went to school 7 days a week. This includes Shabbat, the Sabbath. Now, what would happen on Shabbat during the Sabbath is all the kids would be stood up in front of the congregation and they would recite to the congregation everything that they had memorized from Torah the previous 6 days. So this went on from age 5 to about 12. Now, even though writing and reading materials were scarce, children were taught literacy. They were taught to read and write. Now, where did all this take place? We assumed, a lot of us, I know I did, synagogue was a place of worship and prayer. Well, yeah, that did happen there, but actually its real primary purpose, synagogue, which was a Pharisee thing, the Pharisees set up the synagogue system all throughout Judea. It was school. They called it Ben Sephir or Ben Midrash. Children learned Torah up until about age 10. And then they learned the Mishnah, the oral law. Mishnah is part of halakha, the how we live. This is where the interpretations of Torah came from. This is, well, how do we keep the Sabbath? Well, we only walk 25 steps and that's it. All of these laws on how to observe the law, interpretations. By age 12, they were fit to travel with their parents to the temple to offer the Passover sacrifice. Now, by our understanding, how old was Jesus when we get the story of him as a boy getting left in the temple? 12. And he's wowing the scholars and the scribes. So really, his school buddies would have been doing the same thing. Now, they may not have been broken off and wowing scribes and scholars, but this was very normal for growing up as a Galilean kid. Of course, by age 13, they had their bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is still around today. Of course, I don't know if it had as much glitz and glamour to it back then as they do now. By age 15, they studied Talmud. Now, Talmud is a study of, it's got Torah, but it's more of a study of civil law and ceremonial law. Civil law being, crime and punishment. Which of course goes in with the 10 Commandments, which is part of the Torah. Ceremonial law. This is how the liturgy involved in offering sacrifice. This is how we pray our prayers for this, that, and the other. This is the way you go about going to ask a girl out to date. This is the way you go about asking her father if you can ask her out to go out to date, etc. By 18, the Judean young man would have, for lack of better words, graduated from school. 18 is about the average age of your high school graduate. Now, young men were encouraged to marry and then quickly afterwards pursue a vocation. Now, if a young Galilean fella felt he had the calling and he wanted to go deeper into studying the law, he would go chase down a rabbi to be his mentor, and he would be the disciple. Now, it was not uncommon for rabbis. Now, there was a process of delineation of all right, let's put ourselves in a prayerful state, just like becoming a priest. The rabbi would decide whether this is the right thing to do or not, whether, maybe you have the gift or God tells me otherwise. But it was not uncommon at all for rabbi who saw somebody that he felt had gifts, had the know-how, or at least the pliability, he would go recruit them, approach them. Come, follow me, and I will teach you. Now, do we know another rabbi who did the same thing? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious where the age is. Like, there's some carryover to this, like in our society today, at age 18, you can join the military. You can drink at 21. I just wonder who set these arbitrary ages?
Okay. We're going to get into that. And I'm really glad you asked that question. That comes from out of the Talmud.
Up a little bit.
Like, you're missing that at 21, you got manifest.
Yeah.
But that's right.
Well, kids were a lot more grown up back then. I mean, shoot, my mom married my dad on her 19th birthday and had me before her 20th birthday. By today's standards, she was still a girl, but in my eyes, she was never a girl. She was a woman. And bless her heart, left little bitty Castleberry, Alabama. She married my dad November 2nd. 6 weeks later, just before Christmas, found out she was pregnant with me. The day after Christmas, Dad comes home from work and says, guess what? I've been offered a job with Ford Motor Company in Detroit. So this 19-year-old girl is uprooted from all she knew, her parents and environment and friends, in this little bitty town called Castleberry, population 300, to a city of 5 million. And, it was a heck of a way to have to grow up. But these ages were established in the Talmud. Now, what's interesting for me, it takes about 10 years to become a fully certified rabbi. Now, it's not like they got a degree or a sheepskin. At least this type of rabbi did. Father, when you were ordained, during the ordination rite, did the bishop not lay their hands upon you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were given your ordinance. This goes all the way back to Moses. It began there when Moses is about to step out of the scene, places his hands on Joshua and says, okay, kid, it's all yours. Go with God and you have the power. A lot of what we do, because of what Jesus did, it's because of what the Jews did. Our faith is born in Judaism, and there is so much from Jewish law that we live under and we don't even realize. And hopefully, as we get into by next week, as we really start digging into the scriptures, we're going to see just how close we are. Now, if you take a survey, you take a survey amongst both Jews and Christians, ask, can you be both Jewish and Christian? Both sides invariably, majority are going to say no, except our Messianic friends. They get it. They acknowledge Yeshua as a Messiah, and they love the New Testament, and so on. So we don't know. Did Jesus have a mentor? Did someone lay upon? I mean, you know, we don't have any record of self-proclaimed rabbis, but that remains a mystery. And maybe he was, maybe somehow. But did somebody place their hands upon Jesus and say, you are ordained? The life of the rabbi. Rabbis were itinerant. They didn't stay in one place. It's not like a synagogue had an in-house rabbi, like we have an in-house rector, in-house pastor. You know, early on in this country, in the 1800s, and even through the early part of the 1900s in rural America, it was not unusual to have circuit riding preachers. This was a big tradition with the Methodists and especially the Baptists, because these tiny little places with tiny little churches, they couldn't afford to support a full-time pastor. Without trying to get too off track, if you get up into North Alabama, especially around the Sand Mountain region, you're going to find some very, very old Methodist churches. And the Methodists were really responsible for helping establish the early formation of the public school system here in Alabama. And those little churches became the first schools. And the Methodist bishops would place priority of having a full-time teacher in that area before they would a full-time pastor, because it just made sense. The education was, and a part of education was Bible. So, okay. Rabbis traveled from village to village, synagogue to synagogue, and yes, each had their own disciples. And they did not receive pay for this. Nobody, after a rabbi gave a sermon, nobody passed the plate for a love offering or anything like that. So rabbis were bivocational. They had to pay for themselves, and so did their disciples. When they would visit a small town or village, someone would host them and allow them to stay. And they would never stay. Usual stay was about a couple of days, maybe a week. It would be highly, highly unusual if a rabbinical stay in a village was like 2 or 3 weeks. If that did happen, chances are something was wrong and needed addressing. You know, maybe the local congregation, its spiritual health was not healthy. So the rabbi felt that they need to stay and try to correct the situation. But for the most part, it was just a couple of days stay and they would move on. They sometimes would teach inside that home. Often, though, a lot of them would, if it was a nice day like today and the temperature was right, they like to teach out in the town square. Maybe sit under a shade tree, have the children sitting around them. That way people could see what was going on and people could hear what was going on. But outside of that, most of the education did go on inside the Ben Safir synagogue. Now, there was another type of rabbi that you would not find in a synagogue. And this was called the authoritative rabbi. These guys attended during Jesus's day, one of two prestigious schools. One was the school of Shammai and the other school of Hillel. Shammai and Hillel were very prominent scholars mid first century BC to late first century BC, and both of which did a time serving on the Sanhedrin. Now, that was not a new thing in the Jewish faith. You go back through the Old Testament, Samuel, he had his kind of informal school. It had about maybe 50 would-be prophets. Elijah did the same thing. So did Elisha. Elisha kind of inherited Elijah's school after Elijah was carried off to heaven. You can read about that in Samuel and in the book of Kings. Now, what made these authoritative rabbis special? Going to these special schools was by the time they had the hands laid upon them and they were given authority, they had the ability to interpret Torah. These were the guys that became the scholars that would write the commentaries, that would interpret Torah, that would become part of Talmud or Halakha, because they were considered authoritative. So to answer your question, some guy from either Hillel or Shammai said, okay, 13's a good year for bar mitzvah. 18's a good time to get married. That's where that came from.
Mike, who was what school did Paul study under?
I am so glad you asked that. Okay. Paul went to the school of Hillel. Hillel was the great-grandfather of Gamaliel. And anybody who know the name Gamaliel? Mentor to Saul of Tarsus. Saul was on his way. He was very scholarly, and he was en route to becoming one of those authoritative rabbis. And one of the great benefits of becoming an authoritative rabbi was not just because of the acknowledgement that you know the law and you get to interpret the law and even write law. It had political advantages because that was the pathway towards getting a seat on the Sanhedrin. There, a rabbi could get paid. That's right, just like today. You want a good income, become a politician. And then it was on the Roman dime too. And you know, it's kind of interesting to study for me. I find that real interesting that had Saul not literally saw the light, that he would have, you know, after his crusade of persecution, received his award, sat down and did scholarly things, and then who knows, ended up on the Sanhedrin, not only writing laws, but getting to execute his own laws. So that was rabbinical life. Now, the type of rabbi Jesus was by far outnumbered the authoritative rabbis. Let me see if I could find that quote. I guess I missed that quote. Okay. I had a quote in here by a professor of Hebrew history at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, talking about that the quality of education and the quality of observations and writings by Galilean rabbis by far surpassed those of their Judean contemporaries, and that they were stronger in ethic and nature than Judean, because the Judean rabbinical tend to get political. And when you look at the environment they were in, you can understand it was political, because authoritative rabbis were politicians. So now we have a picture of kind of what it would have been like to become a rabbi for Jesus. Now, we don't know what went on in that 10-year training period. But we now see where he begins his ministry. And just like some of the other rabbis, he goes around and he starts hand-picking disciples one at a time, because he sees something in them. And thank God he did, because look what all they achieved after his ascension. There is so much about our faith that is based on the faith that Jesus observed. Yeah, we acknowledge he was God incarnate, the Son of God. But I try to pay more attention to his human things, his human qualities. Now, granted, he healed the sick, healed the blind, he raised the dead, he walked on water, he chased out demons. These are things you and I, these are gifts we probably don't have. I'm not going to say maybe you couldn't chase, I don't know. But nothing about what Jesus did beyond those things was taking a God shortcut. He lived a very normal human life. He sweated, he toiled, probably worked with his dad building stuff. You know, he too became a carpenter. He's referred to as a carpenter every once in a while in the Gospels. That's the stuff I try to look at, because that aspect of Jesus' life intentionally was him setting an example of how we should behave. And by the time he gives the greatest oratory ever given in the history of humankind, the Sermon on the Mount, that is for us our Talmud. That is our halakha. That is his not just interpretation of the law. I use the word clarification of the law. And we're going to break that down next week when we go back and forth between the Gospels and the books of the prophets and Leviticus, because there are some very astounding facts to be seen and discovered. And especially when we get into some more of Jewish law that's not included into the New Testament. We found out some even, it's amazing just how Jewish he was. And probably one of the reasons why we don't know this as much in our Christian culture as folks did in the first century. Christianity began as a Jewish sect. That's accepted. And then by the time the destruction of Jerusalem came along, which very well probably would have scattered, if not destroyed, the church in Jerusalem itself, founded by James. And that's when Christianity really started becoming predominantly Gentile. By the 3rd century, as Christianity was accepted by Rome as the official Roman religion, I'm sorry to say this, and it feels shameful, but the Romans were still very anti-Semite. Jews, even under Constantine, were still under Judaeus Fiscus. Judaeus Fiscus, Jew tax. If you were Jewish, you had to pay a tax just to have the right to be a Jew. So, I mean, even though the patriarchs of the 3rd century, the first synod, got together and they put together what would be the canon, and they decided to, okay, we'll include the Jewish law. They really downplayed a lot of the fact that Jesus was a Jew. And it got lost over the years. Now, I'm not saying that we should have a return to Judaism. No. But I think we would benefit us. I know it benefits me when I try to understand Jesus, the Jewishness of Jesus, to understand him more. I think it it behooves us all to appreciate more of who he was, what he was trying to say, not just to them, clarify them. Remember, how many times has Father Josiah reminded us in his Sunday school lessons, the whole premise behind God choosing a people in the first place? I mean, it wasn't for the sake of he wanted his own little pet group of codependent little minions. Okay. As Father Josiah succinctly pointed out, God chose a people to be a beacon, a light to the world, to show the world this is what life with me is like. When adhered to my love, adhered to my law, there is peace, there is harmony, there is prosperity. It is to be an attractive thing. It is to be a thing where people say, wow, what do they have that I don't? I want some of that. So that city of light, that beacon of hope could grow. Now, unfortunately, human nature being what it is, our Jewish forefathers kind of saw themselves as being secluded. We are separate. We are not to be in the world. So rather than being attractive, they kind of covered up their light. And Jesus came to tell them, no, take your cover off your light. My kingdom, my Father's kingdom is here, and you are to be it, and you are to be that hope of the world. And that's what he's teaching us. And that's what was taught to ancient Judeans initially. But somewhere things just kind of got off track.
Mike, ask a question.
Please.
There's pretty specific ways to give and to tithe. I mean, tithing is a Jewish law and a Jewish principle. And so that money would be used to build like the temple, like the second temple. But how were local synagogues like around Galilee funded? Did the community themselves just build it? Or
Yes.
was that supported by?
Yeah, the community themselves, and again, you didn't have an in-house rabbi, but every congregation had elders that lived there within the community. And it would be upon the elders to make sure that the school and place of worship, the synagogue, was maintained, kept up. And pretty much everything would be done on a voluntary basis, Joseph being a carpenter, who knows? Maybe, there was a rafter that needed to be replaced in their synagogue in Nazareth. He would have gone and gladly helped out replace that rafter. That's just what people did because it was the community place. It was to each and every one of them. So a lot of that probably would have just been done by trade and labor. And yeah, they would pass the hat from time to time. There would be a small tithe or such. But again, these folks were not wealthy, but they did give what they could give and had to give. So, any other questions, observations? Mike, you're wrong.
So we assume the vast majority of rabbis would have been married with families.
Yes.
Were they subject to the same tax laws as other citizens?
Yes. Yes. And that was, and see, they were getting at dual indemnity, especially when Herod was in, all of Herod's expansion and in all of his public works didn't come on the Roman dime. It came on the Hebrew back and out of the Hebrew pocket. So you have that tax. You also had temple tax. Remember when Jesus came through and just tore the daylights out of the marketplace? Because it was predatory. The upcharging on, okay, you need a blessed animal, okay, you can buy your own blessed chicken right here in a cage, or buy your own blessed lamb, Or all right, how many of you have traveled internationally before? Okay. Something Rachel learned the hard way when we went to Scotland last year. when we got off the airport, there's a kiosk there where you can go get, you know, your money exchanged. Don't go to those places. That's like borrowing money from Guido with no deck. The best thing to do is go to your local bank before you go and get your money exchanged. Well, see, that's what was going on in the temple, because there's so many different types of currency floating around. So, these money exchangers would, you know, put a hefty upcharge on this. That's predatory. You know?
Mike, the broader context is that in Passover, Jerusalem would be flooded with people from literally all over the world.
All over the world.
The obligation
From
being that every
diaspora.
adult Jew, even if you didn't live in Jerusalem, had to attend Passover in Jerusalem at least once.
Yeah.
In your life. So as you say, this is a money exchange, and the temple tax had to be paid in local currency.
That's right.
So all these people are coming. That's why Jesus hits the ceiling.
You know, I had
Because you say it's
mentioned,
predatory.
I had mentioned to you about Herod's son being so bad that the Romans kicked him out. One of the reasons why the major civil unrest, after he had a couple of guys executed for it, the first mistake he made was he wanted to hurry things along and get Rome to recognize him as being the king of Judea. So he thought he would brown nose them a little bit and have the symbol of the Roman Empire, a giant golden eagle placed upon the temple. Well, that raised a ruckus with the Jewish people, and the story goes that a rabbi and two of his disciples, Pharisee disciples, went and tore it down. So Herod had them executed. Well, then there was a bigger uproar. So now he decides to execute martial law, the equivalent of, which coincided with Passover. So nobody could observe Passover. So that raised such an uproar that the Romans just came in and said, just get out. So. Any other questions?
Thanks, Mike. Let me make a few announcements. That was great. Mike's going to meet next week. He's going to keep talking about it. And I think I learned something new about the itinerant rabbinical, you know, modern day Judaism all flows out of the rabbinical tradition. So the Sadducees dissolved with the temple. And so all modern day Judaism kind of comes and flows out of this. So it's really interesting. So next week we do have Suzelle and her wife are coming. We're going to give a little blessing. It's their 1 year anniversary, and Susan's going to give them a marriage blessing.
Cause you're gonna be running.
I'll be running. I have a marathon in Washington DC, and if I'm not done by this time next week, then I want you to pray that either I'm done or that God sends his chariots down to pick me up and take me home. But we also are going to have 8 people from Cameroon come to the service next week.
Oh, wow.
These are people who are legally seeking asylum.
Well, they're 100% legal, so
100%
don't even
legal.
worry about it.
Asylum seekers coming through. And, you know, Suzelle and, well, I would say Claire and her sister especially have been working with helping the resettlement process for legal asylum seekers coming to America. We were talking about this for years. For years, they were shipping people to Edgewater County. And then when they were trying to get reestablished or resettled in America, so they just took them to Edgewater County prison and left them in the prison on top floor. And then when they can make it go through the system, see the judge, they would send them to Birmingham, with like a bus ticket or a plane ticket and say, good luck. And then we meet them in Birmingham. If they're going to Minnesota, we give them a, you know, Suzelle.
Okay, so
Two things up.
I've
Claire and Claire's sister had this organization where they were helping meet folks.
Yeah, but I had never seen anything like Deacon Lou. We collected coats. St. Thomas really came through on the coats. Deacon Lou was like, okay, where are you going? Florida, you get the sweater. You're going to California, you don't need a coat. She was awesome.
So we would meet folks and we were trying to get them the supplies they needed for the road. So like, if you're going to Minnesota, you need a jacket. If you're going to Florida, you need like a tank top and a Bud Light. So whatever you needed in whichever direction you're heading. So 8 people from Cameroon coming next week. Yeah, I'm not gonna be here, so I expect you to be hospitable. And when I come back, I'll report on your hospitality to them. But then afterwards, Suzelle and Maggie will be down here to talk more about after the service. But please come 9:15 next week for Mike. He's in charge and it's gonna be great. I'm recording this and I'll drop it online. So if anybody was not here or if you want a copy, let me know and we'll hook you up. Right, Mike?
Yes, sir.
You know, Mike? It also helps put in perspective, not just Jesus, but also Paul, you know?
Yeah.
Let me turn this off here. So like, it makes sense when you say he was studying